Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We're with our friend Whatifalthist, who is currently doing a video on a study of decadence when societies commit suicide. Now, this is totally new for me. The Whatifalthist that I've covered Will World War III start soon? Probably not. I've also covered his How Canada Will Fall, which is a spicy video. That one has the most comments out of any other video I've done so far. And so I thought this one would be interesting. It just came out like 2 days ago, so this is a brand new video. And I thought, hey, let's check it out. And don't really have anything to say. I don't know what to expect. I'm going to expect demographics to come up at some point. Classic Whatifalthist. So yeah, without further ado, let's check this out. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Yeah, let's see what he says.
Decadence. If you know what that word means, it should evoke images of giant Roman orgies.
Decadence is, well, okay, actually, let's see how he defines it before I define it.
Peacocks in the serving tables, and people vomiting up their food so they can wolf down another round. Alternately, the triple chocolate cake at your local bakery, which is marketed as decadent. However, what actually is decadence? It's a very vibey word, and people throw it around a lot, not really knowing what it actually means. However, I'd like to look deeply at decadence here. What is it? What forms it? What does it lead to? What it consists of? And most importantly, are we decadent in what we can do?
Where does he get this footage?
This will be a painful journey through the times of history where history just stopped since people were too busy drinking plum wine while sleeping with their Circassian slave girls.
I really like this guy. Despite the fact that almost every video I've criticized in some manner, I really do like what he does.
Hi everybody, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind Whatifalthist, and decadence is in a lot of ways symbolized by men's luxury and status. And nothing symbolizes that than a landed title, an experience you can get with established titles. Established Titles is a company that sells you a lordship in Scotland. Yes, you can become an actual lord holding a title and land in Scotland that you can brag about to.
Okay, that to me is real decadence. When you have to buy a square foot or a square meter of land so that you can have a title of an earl so you can annoy your friends with it, but
your friends.
Okay.
It also makes a great gift for friends and family. Your title's official and you can use it on...
Let's go here. Back to the video.
It's the early 11th century. Two different millennia-old proud civilizations are under attack from barbarians to their north. India is being invaded by Mahmud of Ghazni, one of the greatest commanders of all time, a Turk from Central Asia who rose from obscure origins to command of an army of Turks and Afghans invading northern India. Mahmud's army slams into the Gangetic Plain, a region even then populated by tens of millions of people. He fights at the Battle of Cha very outnumbered and somehow wins against the local Indian forces. The Turkish armies are able to ride circles around the much larger Indian armies, having the Indian elephants trample their own troops. He then rapes northern India. And how do the local Hindu Rajas respond? Not by improving their militaries or taking on the tactics that made the Muslim conquerors so powerful. Instead, by building temples to please the gods to grant them victory. Over the next 300 years, the Muslims gradually conquer almost all of India, outnumbered 100 to 1 in population. Meanwhile, in China, the exact same thing is happening with the Sung dynasty, which is facing invasions from the Liao people of Manchuria. The barbarians here, again, outnumbered 100 to 1 in population, are able to defeat and drive the ethnic Chinese from their core region in northern China, forcing their relocation to Hangzhou on the Yangtze River. How did the Chinese respond to these military defeats? By composing poetry about how much they wanted to reconquer the north, while not actually funding or reforming the military to do so. There was a Chinese saying at the time, in the same way good metal isn't going to nails, good men don't go into the military. So there's no reason to reform or improve the military. Let's jump to another example.
Okay, I don't know much about this period of history, to be fair. Maybe someone can help me out there on the comments, but alright, I'll take his word for it.
The Roman Empire is falling and the Germanic barbarians are outside a city in southern France. The defenders don't provide any defenses and are in fact working with the barbarians against their local rivals only to have their city sacked. It was incomprehensible that the barbarians could be a real threat after Rome had been strong for so long. It had been centuries since non-Roman threats had been in the area. In all of these cases, we see a shared subset of decadence, which is the sheer disconnect from fundamental reality that's manifested here through the utter inability to deal with the real world of literal barbarians coming in, destroying everything these people loved. Decadence comes in many forms, whether an overt or insane luxury, belief in bizarre and backwards fads, and the list can go on, but on all the fundamental bases, it's an inability to come to terms with the reality that's staring straight at you, and instead preferring to hide behind some culturally constructed vision of the world.
Okay, all right. So taking that's his definition, let's move forward. Nietzsche has some really interesting writings on decadence as well. Does decadence really exist?
People have always just assumed decadence has existed since the dawn of time. It's one of those things like loneliness, powerful sex drive, or human nature.
So he says, in the present world, it's tribalism and nationhood, even though we are in an era of inter-ethnic struggle and geopolitical competition. In communist states, it tends to be self-interest since it's supposedly part of the collective one reality. Okay.
Of whose existence people deny on a philosophical basis when its truth is too painful to acknowledge. For example, Julius Caesar would just casually write out how the native tribes of France, the Gauls, had gone soft due to urbanization and contact with Roman luxuries, and so were losing out to the more savage Germans who had neither of those. Alternately, one of my favorite, and I think one of the most talented history writers of all time, Amaury de Riencourt, would write about how certain Asiatic peoples like the Chinese or Indians had gone soft against tribal groups like the Mongols or Afghans in the 1950s, and that was just viewed as the consensus historical opinion at the time. The only big group of people that have ever argued that decadence doesn't exist across history are Marxist materialists. These people believe that the only important factor in the development of human societies is economic factors, something that's extremely easy to disprove and pretty simplistic. And thus, for Marxists, to try to explain history with something like culture, chance, or real soft human terms, they will say that it's not scientific since it's not relating back to empirical economic conditions. Marxists have always been incentivized to push their theory of history and economics, which they say is inevitable since it's really the only way they can justify their economic plans that are otherwise horrifying and foolish. However, even if we couldn't disprove the communist understanding of history on an intellectual basis, it's been disproven in the real world and that capitalism has only become more powerful, made the working classes vastly more prosperous, and
trying to see if there's anything missing here. I think maybe Angola. Because Angola was communist for a while.
Communist states have killed tens of millions only to fail, thus in effect destroying every single one of Marx's predictions. Also, communists low-key support decadence in the capitalist order so that capitalism can be replaced by the revolution, so talking too loudly about modern decadence isn't a good idea for the communist movement as a whole. However, liberal arts departments at universities are controlled by, and I'm not exaggerating here, by the intellectual descendants of Marxists, and so we stand with a fundamentally materialistic understanding of human history that's just really at odds with the actual human condition.
Okay, so we're getting into the university debate of Marxism. What is this table exactly? Radical, activist, Marxist of what points? Of Yale professors. See, that's the thing though, is that if you just pick Yale professors, right? If you pick just one university and you say it's representative of all universities, then, I mean, of course, Yale is going to be more liberal than conservative. I think it has a long tradition of liberalism. And then, okay, so we're getting into the spiciness already. I don't know. My personal opinion on this is that I think that the we have Marxist professors conspiracy theory is very overblown. I attended a university in Toronto, Canada, probably the most progressive place in Canada. And I mean, I went to business school, so I don't know, maybe I mixed the Marxist hinge, but yeah, I had zero experience with any professors that ever spoke at ends about late stage capitalism and all these other things. So another thing to note here too is that if you look at 41% say they're very liberal, right? But 34 and 18% say they're moderate or somewhat liberal, right? So this is your basic center left and then your centrists, right? And so even then, although, you know, being very liberal is quite high, you have to remember that in the center here, right? And I considered center left, center right to still be the center. And it also doesn't define what conservative is. Is that very conservative? Is that somewhat conservative, right? So you have to sort of sit here in the middle and think, okay, where do these people are actually the majority, right? So Anyways, let's continue on.
So we stand with a fundamentally materialistic understanding of human history that's just really at odds with the actual human condition. At the same time, the post-World War II reaction against Nazism meant that comparing any two cultures to show which is superior is seen as wrong, has made the study of decadence kind of taboo as well.
I think that's silly. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you can absolutely say that a culture such as, I don't know, pretty much, any country is better than that of, say, North Korea, right? A totalitarian dictatorship. I guess it's sort of harder to say along culture, because culture sort of lies in more the subjective realm. But to say that you can't do it, I think that's just completely incorrect. There are lots of cultural practices that we obviously, by we, I mean we in the Western world, disagree with, and those are quite popular, right? You can look at something like LGBTQ rights in certain parts of the world. There are some countries' view towards women, and those are pretty outwardly condemned from Westerners, so to say. And that goes both ways as well with people on the other side of the world condemning some of our social practices, right? So, I don't know about that one. So the abolition of slavery is a perfect example. However, the argument are equal is a faith-based argument made by the left to maintain power and prevent another Nazi movement. That is a hell of a statement. Made by the left to maintain power and prevent another Nazi movement. All right, man.
And I mean, I think it's pretty easy to see that changes in human culture have had profound effects on history. Think of how, for example, in our own times, how changing attitudes towards gay people have altered our society.
True.
Alternately, look at how we, say, wouldn't challenge someone to a duel like we would 300 years ago, and compare it to how crime stats have worked out since then.
Yeah, and even then, dueling was quite unfashionable. You can see here around the 1700s. Dueling did get very unfashionable because it was not a good idea to have all your higher ranking officers kill each other in the name of honor. I mean, Alexander Hamilton was famously shot in a duel, right? And there was a fair few amount of great people in history that were lost to a stupid, idiotic practice. Okay. But again, long-term homicide rates can't be intrinsically linked to dueling. Rather, there was also economic conditions. And you can see here that there's a big spike as well in the 1800s, but okay.
I think in almost all cases, our grandparents worked harder than we did. Once you magnify all these subjective cultural shifts over history...
Okay. What's your definition of hardworking? More laborious work? Sure. Fair. Of course. Right? Agriculture's hard. It's hard on your body. It's physical labor. But we also have different forms of work now that we didn't have then, but okay.
You can see how the real human character of society has immense effects in the course
God,
of history.
this is going to be a long video.
There's this theory of a three-part structure to the development of societies that we've seen starting with the Greeks and Romans, and many historians, including myself, still agree with. This was a view of history that we've seen Livy, Machiavelli, Ibn Khaldun, or the greatest social theorists of the pre-modern world and the biggest geopolitical analysts today agree with. Societies start in a state of barbarism in which people are filled with vigor and a kind of unsophisticated power, just doing what they want without much clear thought, but making up with it in raw energy. This was Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, a Europe with witch trials, the conquistador conquest of the New Worlds, and the wars of religion. These kinds of societies hate others for the sole reason of being different. Next, you see a phase called civilization, which is a society that will temper its savagery with rational thought and articulation, while also maintaining the vigor and energy that goes with the earlier stages. These societies are capable of thinking critically about themselves and making improvements, or taking in foreign ideas that work, while also maintaining a strong pride in their own culture. In modern Europe, this was in the 18th and 19th centuries, the eras of the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution. Eras where intellectuals were able to bend...
So sorry then, does he discount then the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans being civilized then? Or is he... Sorry if I misunderstood that one, but okay, so we're going to say that in Europe that it wasn't quite a three-part structure, but rather a sort of phase structure, a cyclical structure, so to say, that it went back to barbarism, but... Okay, I'll let that one go. Maybe I'm misheard.
Rationality and science to benefit society, while the common soldier who still believed in God was willing to die for his nation and Europe's colonies grew. Finally comes decadence, which is honestly where Europe is today. Europe's young decadence came in the early 20th century when Europeans stopped believing in Christianity that had been the very bedrock of their society since the Roman Empire. This resulted in a series of horrifying godless tyrannies like communism, fascism, and the like that killed over 100 million people. Western society lost its virtue, if you want to say that.
Okay, but again, is he proclaiming that secular societies lead inherently to decadence, or is it people's belief in Christianity that fades that then leads to tyranny? You know what I mean? Like, what's the progress here, so to say? But all right.
After the loud decadence came a quiet,
this is going to be a long
decadence. Maybe Europeans couldn't achieve their great goals of being masters of the world and carving out a utopian future. And maybe Europe had been pseudo-colonized by its former colonies, but Europeans could at least build fair, prosperous, and just societies. However, over time, we saw Europeans even lose belief in their own rights to exist as societies, hating the most those who had the expansive or proud image of Europe.
So he brings up the latest migrant crisis as an example. I don't want to get too far into this. The European elite pushes for greater diversity or de-whitening as a reflexive form of self-love. Okay, I'm not going to get into this one. This is too far into sort of spicy politics, and I want to stick away from that overall. So I'm just going to let that slide. But this is something that I do disagree with. And I'm glad that at least he put in here, this is not an attack on immigration in general. Immigration has generally been positive in the U.S. You would see successful groups. But, okay. I don't agree with what he said, but let's keep going.
What had happened here? How could Europeans have seen the signs coming? When had this happened before? What does it all mean, and what should we expect? Well, let's turn to the historic precedent to try to build a logic of decadence.
Okay.
There's an underlying fundamental logic to how decadence and all its bizarre irrationality works. It is the willingness to put culturally constructed reality above reality.
I think that was where, I think that's where Göring was staying, where that photograph was taken, when he was hiding out when the Allies came and basically peacefully captured him.
In this process, the cultural constructions become bitter at realizing their own weakness and thus try to tear themselves apart, while ignoring the outside world that they fundamentally understand they are at odds with. Let me explain. Humans operate through two different kinds of genetic selection. There's sexual and Darwinistic. Darwinistic selection is when the tribe next door has better spears and invades and conquers your people, thus killing you all and having their genes succeed. Sexual is that girls, or more accurately across most societies, the parents who arrange marriages, prefer mates from, say, a certain religious group or people who wear a certain fashion, thus resulting in their greater genetic proliferation. The adoption of, modern professional militaries was caused by the first trend, and the adoption of the hippie New Age values since the 1960s was driven by the latter, or the competing pushes of survival and popularity. In successful and healthy societies, the things that make people popular are the things that result in a society's survival. This is what societies are in the state of barbarism.
Actually, wait. I wanted to pick a point on this. Left starting in the 1960s and structuring that moved to left around maximizing empathy for the oppressed. Is that really a bad thing? Really, to consider human rights first? Okay.
Are the things that close to the earth and their surroundings, and so weren't too divorced from their natural biological nature, and so were able to keep their genes and group surviving. If we exclude how morally wrong the factors involved were, the conquistadors really did fuck and spread Western culture, while the military conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries really did set Europe up for world dominance. Even the witch trials were in effect a Darwinistic way of weeding out non-breedable women and installing more natal norms among women for a higher birth rate.
Huh? How the what? That didn't make any sense. How is that? Okay.
Yet, over time,
Okay. I mean, the Salem witch trials, first off, that's a whole video in and of itself, but it was not just older, non-breeding women that were selected. There were also young women. I mean, there were also men that were killed in the Salem witch trials. So that was a preposterous statement, but
societies develop, people become safer. Strangely, both intellectually and physically. Physically is obvious, and as the state becomes more powerful, people don't have to deal with external threats as much. What was true with all the cases of decadence mentioned at the beginning was that people didn't have to face external threats in those countries for periods of hundreds of years, meaning average people just stopped thinking about really brutal war as a real possibility.
But then there were lots of internal threats.
We see this trend in much of the modern West, where in large parts of the West, whether countries like Canada, Australia, much of America, and Western Europe, war is something that happens in other eras in history, and the best way to prevent future wars is to act as if they can't happen. Ask a member of the chattering...
What is that map? Regions that think having a large military to wage offensively is morally wrong. All of Canada? How can you... Okay, all right, sure. So all of Canada thinks that having a large military to wage offensive war is morally wrong. Again, that entirely depends on the context, especially with the... Okay, I'm gonna leave that one be. Let's keep going.
And they would start with milquetoast statements like diplomacy. Well, if you actually suggested what diplomacy really entails with coups...
The kind of people who read the New York Times, watch SNL, drink kombucha, the kind of... Okay.
Arranging revolts and local wars, they'd shudder. Alongside diplomacy, you would hear recommendations of denunciations, cooperation among the global community, and other things that are basically meaningless. At the same time, it's inside the self-interest of the governments involved to pacify their own people. The legendary German historian Oswald Spengler talks about the process of moving from culture to civilization, or when societies shift from creating to codifying the things previous generations have created. A key part of this process is that an ideological managerial elite seizes power, which requires, I explain, the second point of intellectual safety. In the start of societies where people are close to the earth, they have to keep their values realistic. As an example, watching videos of Americans from 100 years ago, it's remarkable to see how much more disagreeable people they were compared to the present. People were far more willing to tell you exactly what they thought and why it didn't match up.
This was a popular... Okay.
Because people were still clearing the frontier, and there was a clear set of strict values that if you didn't match up to, you were a loser. However...
But again, not every single person was a frontierman, right? There were also people that were living in large metropolitan cities. You had people that... This was around the establishment, so to say, the very beginnings of the middle class, right? And obviously the middle class really did take off post-war. And there were also socialites, cosmopolitans, so not everyone was a frontierman during this time in the United States. So.
However, once a society's elite becomes urban, they start to construct values that are more about pleasing other people who crowd around them on all sides, rather than rural populations who have to deal with the real world on a daily basis.
Again, I don't think that's fair entirely.
Unless there's a massive developmental or organizational difference between them, I can't think of a single war where a more urban country beat a rural one. Rome beat Carthage where the Soviet Union beat Germany.
I'd have to think about that.
An especially enlightening example is Britain and France in the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain was a country where the elite lived in the countryside, and France was one where the elite lived around the court in Paris. French politics in this era basically existed to aggrandize the central court and maintain popularity, whether through fashion, waging expensive wars to expand the monarchy, while agriculture, industry, and the colonies floundered.
But again, to sort of dumb it down to simply, well, the elites lived in urban centers, therefore they lost. Like, yeah, okay, maybe there was a cause if we take them at face value. But, and I'm not entirely familiar with the wars during that period. But even then, I mean, when Napoleon was conquering most of Europe, the elites were doing the same thing, but I digress.
While in Britain, where the elite were dispersed among the population, we saw agricultural, mercantile, and industrial
It's much more complicated than that, though.
Thrived. In every single decadent society, the elites are urban, removed from the means of production, and compete in popularity contests against each other that is little meaning to the rest of the world. We've scarcely seen this trend develop in the Western world, where the governmental ruling classes have become government bureaucrats who have no relation to the real economic and social conditions that they levy regulations upon. The economic elite are giant corporations that distantly control their various continent-spanning empires, and the cultural elite are all socially isolated from the real world in wealthy bubbles in places like Los Angeles and New York. As society centralizes, it removes people's ability to act on a local level. Once this occurs, it makes the leadership of the system dumber, since decisions are being made in the top by people unaware of the conditions at the bottom, rather than organically through the whole society.
True. Okay, so that's one thing that I actually will agree on. There is one thing that's been interesting about United States politics in the past 100 years or so, as well as Canadian too, is that the sort of loss of local politics, of really communities banding together. But again, I think a lot of this doesn't come from sort of decadence, but rather I think it comes from information. It comes from the ability to move information so quickly. right? Especially with the internet, with the printing press, obviously much earlier. But the internet now, I mean, it's become so interconnected, right? The fact that I know while I'm sitting in Vienna as a Canadian exactly what's happening with the Board of Education in Tennessee, right? The fact of that matter is that everything becomes much more international. And so I would actually put that more onto information and how it spreads in communication and technology rather than, a decadent decay due to elites and their social standing and removing them from production.
When people's actions are judged based on popularity inside their local social communities rather than actually spreading a society in the real world, stuff like agreeability, compliance, or being indoctrinated with the values of the society become important. High society becomes a giant court where people try to fake agreeability and kindness to gain allies rather than a warband where people speak and act plainly. This is definitely something I've seen in successful circles in America where people act in overly polite and pretend to be sensitive so as not to offend.
That's just American
society
culture.
Takes on a more feminine character. It's just
Try Austrian.
Generally plays in women's hands more effectively. What's happened in each of these decadent societies is that ideological structures develop to please other people rather than actually accomplish things. These ideological structures in fact try to push people away from the disagreeable real world, instead trusting their ideological documents above reality as people see it. This is
But again, this comes down to just tribalism and groupthink, which is entirely human. I don't think it's just down to decadent societies. I think that's almost part of the human condition.
Push away the anxiety of knowing the world they've created is fake. The historian Amaury de Riancourt also talks about how the society's knowledge gets categorized into a list of okay subjects to study and have opinions on, so society is not intellectually challenged. In Confucian China, this was with forcing the entire elite to study Confucian and ancient Chinese texts that had no relation to their lives. In India, it was domination by a priest class, and in Islam, it was Al-Ghazali, who came to the conclusion that study of the Quran is more important than seeing the outside world, since God determined the outside world at his whim. In Greece and Rome, it was a study of the Platonic forms and Epicureanism. In every case, the only way to judge real-world problems was to read ancient texts, with no space for coming up with new ideas. In the modern West case, it's the idea of a vague secular humanism based on Christian values. We're not in the era of the Enlightenment where people throw around wild ideas at how to improve the world. Instead, we have a codified understanding of how to deal with the world that proud departures from, whether colonizing Mars, waging aggressive wars, massive programs like economic expansion and the like, are viewed with suspicion. Universities, which are the entry to elite, are basically ideological indoctrination camps.
No, they're not.
In every single case above, the decadent elite which ruled through control of ideas tries to then squash all possible competitors, who often gain their power through real-world successes, like the military, business interests, or established religions. China, Rome, and the Islamic world all went through processes of self-imposed decommercialization, in which the elite regulated their economies into poverty, and we've seen the large declines of Europe as a percentage of the world economy, dropping from 28 to 24% of the world's economy, while the US has remained a stable quarter, as part of the exact same process.
Right, but the other thing too is look at the percentages, right? With China obviously becoming a much larger technological power, a much larger production power, and this also comes into the free trade agreements that were made previously, right? Us shipping a lot of our manufacturing, a lot of our jobs out to China. But to say that the growth is going to continue, depending on who you believe, whether China will continue and will overpass the EU, so to say. I have some doubt on that personally, but this is not an economics discussion. But just one key thing to note here is that this is percentage, right? And so of percentage, obviously, it can only be 100. So, of course, the EU is going to decline while China increases. However, that's not to say that the EU is now a broke society, right? It just means that their share is less than before.
Europe has made the conscious decision to turn its back on capitalism.
I mean, also look at Japan, too. Very steady. Latin America, also very steady.
Thus stopping its market and technological development.
Just
look at how Europe's contribution to science
hell of a chart.
Nobel laureates is a
God, that's ugly.
Is a great example of this. The logic of decadence is the gradual removal of every element of society that would try to make trouble or make life more complicated for the urban-dwelling elite living inside their ideological cages. It is a subconscious removal of acknowledgement that there even is an outside world.
That's incredibly stupid. I'm just going to leave it at that.
As removal of any reminder of the outside world forms, there becomes no reason not to indulge oneself. If your position of power is permanent, there's no need to worry about working or try to justify your position. This is where the word decadence association with overindulgence comes from. If you don't have to worry at the outside world, why not drink yourself silly, eat sherbet imported 100 miles by slaves, or throw orgies? At the same time, once the moral code of society is based around popularity, there is no recourse to actions being ridiculous. If people have lost belief in some abstract external idea of truth, there's literally no socially accepted way to discount people who have become completely materialistic and debauched. In turn, in societies driven off popularity contests, once being debauched becomes the norm, everyone must reach it, thus creating a competitive cycle of debauchery. An example of this is when late Republican Romans compete on how exotic animals they could eat, eating ostrich, crocodile, and the like, spending ludicrous sums on importing these animals. In all these cases, we see court-like situations develop in which the elite looks down upon their own countrysides in the outside world, treating their social networks as the only world. In Asian societies, there is normally an emperor, with Ba Sing Se in The Last Airbender actually being a decent example of the sort of thing that happened in real history. I've never seen that show, unfortunately. The emperor never leaving his palace, with thousands of girls in his harem, thousands of bureaucrats, flunkies, and his like inside the palace, building a veritable whole city isolated from the rest of society. In Rome, this also happened on a local level, with provincial capitals operating as mini-societies in much the same way. With average people so cut off from the mega decisions that would determine their lives, they start to become passive, fatalistic, and lose hope.
Where is that in the U.S.? Okay, interesting. Spain, Portugal, Greece, half of southern Italy, India. Interesting. Okay, sure. I thought Canada would be on here as per his How Canada Will Fall video. But
populations here stop being proud of their societies and have to be whipped into battle, basically. When people...
I wouldn't say that Spain is not proud of their society.
Wonder why South Italians don't trust their government at all, or so much of the money the U.S. put towards Iraq was spent corruptly. It's that these were the heartlands of decadent empires that screwed their populations over so much
more complicated
that
than that.
No one trusts anyone else. This happened at differing degrees around the world, depending on how...
He does make a good point, though. Trust is worth a lot of money. Trust is worth an unknown amount of money. The fact that a lot of countries that have low corruption, they operate on trust, it's worth quite a lot. A girl I know, she was from one of the Eastern European countries. I don't want to say which one. And she moved to Canada, and she said one of the things that she loves about Canada is that people trust each other. And it's not just that you blindly trust everyone, be like, oh, here, take my car keys, be back in 3 days. But rather, when you're at a bank and you say, oh, you're trying to take money out, and you're not worried that the person behind you is going to rob you, right? And things like this, you're not constantly worried about your personal security because you can just trust people won't do that. Right? You can trust people that when they say, oh, I forgot cash, I'll be back in 10 minutes, that they're actually going to come back in 10 minutes, right? If you go, I don't know, get your hair cut or something, they don't get card. That's actually worth quite a lot of money. And I think he makes an interesting point by that. But just to say that it's due to specifically evil empires, I don't know. I think the trust is definitely something that relies on a cultural axis. And maybe that has something to do with it. But
parasitic the regimes involved were. What we see with decadence is a complete lack of interest in other societies. In India before the Muslim conquest, the Indians thought that they could learn from no other societies, and even that speaking to non-Hindus would permanently pollute a person. Muslim visitors described Indians as the most arrogant people they had ever met. When a British delegation arrived in China in the 18th century with rifles, steam engines, and clocks, technology literally centuries ahead of anything in China, the Chinese replied the British had nothing of value to them. The Romans and Greeks literally built their idea of civilization not off any objective measures of development, but rather whether other cultures spoke the same language as them. Something that may shock people is that I think the modern West is headed in the same direction. People like to say the West in earlier eras was racist, which is totally right, but the West was also very curious of other cultures. The West adopted so much science and technology from the Muslims and Byzantines during the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, you had massive Indian, Muslim, and Chinese fads in the Western world in the early modern period. With people taking fashions and ideas from those cultures. I mean, Schopenhauer and Hegel's philosophy was taken from India, and the idea of the social contract and modern secular bureaucratic state were taken from China. One of my biggest interests is anthropology and comparing different civilizations, and you basically have to read books written before the 1960s because people really stopped caring after then. It's shocking to see how popular travel and exotic documentaries and movies were before World War II. We now performatively care more about non-Western groups, but actual interest in the outside world's collapsed.
But I don't agree with that at all. And again, it comes down to my argument about technology. right? And I think that the world becoming more open, right, and things becoming more normalized, right? As things become more normalized and you're more used to seeing these things, obviously interest wanes because it becomes normal, right? But I digress, and this is getting very long. So
you never see real analyses of how Western culture differs from China or India, say. You see no actual interest in how foreign cultures operate, or as agents of their own destiny, with the assumption always in modern social justice culture being that Western culture is so superior will always remain dominant, and thus other cultures should not be treated as their own agents. Alternately, adopting things from other cultures is cultural misappropriation, which is a weird, very backwards form of
I'm not going to get into that, but also stupid.
the same sort of customs we saw in earlier decadent societies.
Like cultural appropriation, that is. I think it's a silly concept.
Decadent societies often do have a degree of self-loathing, and it might be subconscious sometimes, and it might be fully conscious. And the modern West's self-loathing is the furthest out example of this in history. And this comes from people realizing that decadent society and the cultural worldview it establishes isn't the real one. So people start to loathe that and try to tear away at the society's foundations so that they can get more in touch with reality. But the truth is that such attempts normally do more harm than good because they don't see what societies fundamentally need to survive and what aspects of that society are necessary. It becomes a deep emotional loathing rather than a realistic attempt to reform the society in a way that actually works.
All right.
I hope I've helped show that many modern societies are dangerously wading through decadence. However, the future is changeable, and I wouldn't fatalistically expect it to just happen. I mean, that would be a very decadent thing to do. However, how do we deal with decadence in the modern world?
That's funny.
I would make the argument that Europe has waded further into decadence than America, since America still has many thriving structures for capitalism, science, military, and the like. America has split down a path of greater decadence and standing against it. There are still many people who stand for the expansion of society in real terms, whether geographically into space, economically, militarily, scientifically, or philosophically in America, which you really don't see in Europe. I'm not sure I would describe any other real societies in the world as decadent. The big...
Aw, poor Northern Quebec. Northern Quebec is no one. Same with most of Brazil. Aw, sad.
Asian civilizations all went through phases of decadence that they were shook out of.
What is all this then? I'm not as familiar with Mexican geography, so if you guys can maybe help me out there.
By European colonialism, which has since forced them to rethink the way they operated. However, for both Europeans and Americans, I would say we have to make a decision about whether we will accept decadence into our society. How should we deal with this? One of the main points to consider is that for intelligent people, decadence is never fun. They can see through the veil of their society running off fumes. Likewise, since there's so little progress and often really irrational social structures, life often isn't the best for normal people either. In a lot of cases, decadence means as much poverty in the lower levels as debauchery and excess in the higher ones.
There's a really great book by Steven Pinker called Progress Now, and he actually goes into a lot of detail using data that's been collected over the past 30 years of how much better economically people are off than they were 30 years ago. I think the big difference is that a lot of the division comes to, as I've mentioned before, open communication, especially social media, but I digress.
Society isn't working right. Lots of people aren't happy in decadent societies, but the culture just doesn't have a lot of new ideas on how to get things done in realistic ways, so the society as a whole stagnates. The main thing that benefits from decadence is stagnation. You know, all the people in society who just want to live their lives and not be bothered with the affairs of the world, they will support decadence so they don't have to think, and also whatever elite group in your society thrives from lack of action. I think there are two different kinds of decadence that come from the timescales involved. There's a slow, quiet decadence that comes to societies as they get older and stop being able to filter new information into their worldview. This is how the Chinese didn't use the gunpowder, which they invented, or refusing to even acknowledge the West's obvious technological superiority.
I think that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think a lot of that comes down to Chinese culture too. I'm okay, this is almost 40 minutes.
Spengler called this the winter of civilization. The second kind of decadence is that of debauchery and lack of moral standard. This is Weimar Germany, an era of mass prostitution, drinking, and partying. This tends to ebb and flow over the centuries in societies, often as reactions to eras of extreme purity, horrible wars, or once you get eras of extremely rapid inflows of money. Unless it's a place like Brazil, this kind of debauchery doesn't last forever, since everyone eventually gets tired of partying after a decade or something.
But again, it's not that everyone is partying for a decade, right? It's like in 1920s, that's like saying that because, nightclubs are open on Saturdays and Sundays that the whole place is just partying constantly. It's like people still had jobs. It was still like it is now, but I digress.
Combining both moral and intellectual collapse with partying is something like the fall of the Roman Republic, in which the moral decay of the Roman nation went with lots of partying and hype. Emperor Augustus was able to reform the Roman Empire afterwards, but Rome was still stuck in the decaying structure of classical civilization, which centuries later resulted in its fall. Our society is in the first group, and I think we have to worry about our society losing its ability to adapt.
Cool photo.
We aren't in the second category, and our society is sadly not overflowing with debauchery and 1920s style parties. The decadence here is largely...
Again, these 1920s style parties, that's because of the media, right? It's because of the representation of the 1920s, right? You look at Dust Bowl farmers in the 1920s, they were not partying it up like that, right? You look at German factory workers in the 1920s, they were not partying it up like that. That was, once again, for, certain people in society and people that were also interested in doing that, right?
Moral in his...
It's like not everyone that lives in Berlin goes to Berghain. Right, so
not come through actual debauchery. This video was inspired by me going to Los Angeles, and I wasn't shocked by how much partying was going on in LA, but instead the bizarre things people spent their money on. Something to keep in mind is that this is the highest era of inequality in all of American history, but the wealthy today tend to not be super ostentatious in the same way they've been in other eras of history. Americans, and wealthy Americans, I would say, on a higher average basis, are still shockingly hardworking. However, when you degrade the moral foundations of society, the rest of it will fall apart over time. We live in an age where reality is largely what we say it is, not what the real world believes. We are completely high on our abilities and not humble of our own weakness, and we see this with stuff like NFTs, gender relativism, modern art, streetwear, and the like, whose sole purposes are to show their absurdity and transgress boundaries without any other real purpose. I think the Western world needs to hold two concepts strong in order to forestall decadence. The first is a concept of personal honor. Honor is the idea that life has a certain degree of value and dignity given to it above merely the roles you were born into. That you can expect this dignity from how people act and defend it inside yourself and as an institution inside society. However, once you remove dignity and honor from societies, as we have in recent decades, we've lost so many moral pillars that we can use to forestall decadence. Look at
this just sounds like an old conservative
celebrity
pitch,
culture. Okay. Apart from the nobility and royalty in previous eras, you would to accomplish something to be glorified by society. However, today we pick celebrities who are popular since they're relatable. We glorify celebrities who make fools of themselves publicly since we don't feel judged by them, and so we don't feel like we have to have a higher moral standard in our society.
And he picks Tekashi 6ix9ine and Adam Sandler. Okay.
Maintaining the principle of honor in our
out of
society,
all the celebrities you could have picked,
uphold a higher...
What about the cult of personality around Elon Musk? I mean, people that think he's one of the most hardworking people ever, and he's a genius. But I think, okay. I don't think he makes a fool of himself, but...
moral standard that whatever our community happens to believe at that given time. When I'm scared and I try to imagine how many of my Irish ancestors died in the noose for rebelling against the English, or how horrible the trenches of World War I must have been, in those cases, my sacrifices appear small according to that perspective. In a society with a strong sense of honor, you can shame people who did dumb things and crass stuff like attend a sexual furry convention or buy NFTs since they are dishonoring their inherent value as human beings.
Oh my god. Wow, okay. Yeah, but isn't that the point though, right? Isn't that the point, is that we live in a free society where you can attend a sexual furry convention and you can buy an NFT if you really wanted to. I'm not a supporter of NFTs, but yeah, but I mean, isn't that the point though, right? Isn't that the freedom that we desire? Isn't that the freedom that we want for our societies, is that individuals are able to make their choices based on their preferences?
Mongols invade, you fight since to not do so dishonor your own value as a human, whether or not your community believes that, or whether or not you live or die. Second idea is faith. Not even faith in God, faith in goodness. The Western intellectual system since the beginning has been built off a combination of faith and rationality. Both of these, when taken too far, have their own problems, with overweening faith resulting in horrifying religious fanaticism and untethered logic spiraling into Nazism and slavery. Rationality cannot exist by itself.
Yeah, okay, fair
There's
enough.
no one who says human life has an inherent rational value, and it doesn't rationally make sense to enslave the neighboring nations. These are things that we realize we would not like done to us, and so on moral faith we make the call. The assumption that the modern agnostic world makes are rooted in fundamentally Christian faith-based understandings of the world that fall apart under logical scrutiny.
The equal value of every human being. Slavery is wrong, falls apart under scrutiny, but okay.
The problem rationality faces is that without humility of its own failings, it quickly becomes arrogant and tries to overreach, and then afterwards, without the emotional supports of faith, it loses hope and sees no reason to live. However, the truth is that you don't need a reason to be good. You don't need a reason to be alive. You don't need a reason to try to advance the human race, reach the stars, expand your nation. No. Life pushes on with its own logic.
But again, one of the things that human beings, one of the things that we deeply need, right, is meaning. Right? And I think that he really discounts meaning here, that every individual has their own meaning to their own life, and it's what's something that drives them, right? Whether that comes from family, from ambitions, from your career, from whatever it is, right? Human beings inherently have that quest for meaning, right? Which is a great book by Viktor Frankl, by the way. So, okay, I don't entirely agree.
If you stand against goodness and the expansion of life, your logic is wrong. We need to take these as articles of faith and first principles in our society. If someone were to argue that we shouldn't colonize space and instead focus on problems on Earth, I would say that we should take on faith that we needed to expand the human race, and doing great projects was good in of itself that we shouldn't question. I could give a bunch of policies here, but that's a whole different video, and I think they logically follow from the principles of faith and honor.
I hope he does it on Canada.
I think if the modern West can learn to fall in love with these two principles again, it will allow it to escape decadence. Decadence comes from when man turns away from the stars and instead drowns himself in wine. However, even if you're standing still in a rocket, you're still going thousands of miles per hour towards the heavens. Whatifalthist, and thanks for watching.
Cool video. Again, another solid one that I liked his conclusion in the end there, that we don't have to be fatalistic. This isn't over. This isn't the end. But there's, again, quite a few spicy modern takes in there, but it just very broad, sweeping brush. Overall, but hey, that's why I like this guy's videos. You know, they're fun, and he's very bold to be able to really put his opinions out there. And even though I disagree with them, I mean, hey, that's one of the beautiful things of living in a free society, is to be able to disagree with people, but still appreciate what they do. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you thought in the comments. I'm sure this will be a couple good ones here. This video is incredibly long. Yeah, hope it isn't too long. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Goodbye.